Hi everybody, welcome back to Thursdays on Jekyll. I'm Corinne, the Program Specialist at 4-H Tidelands Nature Center, and today we're going to be focusing on one of Georgia's unique ecosystems, the salt marsh. Georgia actually has 1/3 of the East Coast's salt marsh. So it's a really neat ecosystem. We're going to take a closer look at some of the plants and animals that live there and how they've adapted to live in this environment. Let's take a look.
A marsh is an area that is influenced by a changing tide. As the tide moves in at high tide and out with the low tide, the water is mixing all of the nutrients inside the marsh. After high tide, some water and salt can get left behind in the marsh. This can create a very salty environment, which can be difficult for a lot of plants and animals to live in. That's why the plants and animals that are out here in the marsh are so special.
All right, we've made it out here into the low marsh. So the low marsh is the area of the marsh that's right next to the tidal creek. And one of the most important plants you'll see in our marsh lives in this area. It's our Spartina grass, Spartina alterniflora. This Spartina grass will take up most of the marsh. What makes it such a productive ecosystem. Its closest relative is actually sugarcane, and it's one of the reasons that our shrimp from Georgia are so sweet. Now over here in the high marsh, we actually have a couple of other plants that are really neat. One we can see blooming right now is our sea oxeye daisy with that nice yellow flower. And we have a few other plants in the high marsh that like to stay out of the water a little more. Our sea pickle. We have a couple different kinds of sea pickle. One is called glasswort, and one is called saltwort. If you've taken our marsh class, you remember we can actually eat these. The flavor might be good for some people, but it tends to be really salty. This whole area has a lot of salt due to the brackish water of our marsh. Brackish meaning a mixture of fresh and salt water. These succulents will take in a lot of that water, but try to keep a little bit of that salt out of their cells so you can really taste it in their leaves. Pretty salty. Now, you'll notice on this sea pickle, it actually has this really yellow leaf. This is actually one way that this plant is trying to get rid of some of the salt in its cells. It's actually putting more salt into this one leaf. Eventually it'll have so much salt that this leaf will just fall off. So if you're a salt lover, take a look for these if you're ever out in the marsh. So a lot of animals depend on the marsh, but only a few call it home. I have a couple of those animals that call the marsh home here. These are fiddler crabs. A lot of you may be familiar with these fiddler crabs if you've taken one of our marsh classes. If you have, can you remember why this crab has this one really large claw and the other crab has two small claws? That's because this one is a male. He uses that large claw to attract a mate. So these fiddler crabs spend their whole lives out here in the marsh, and they're really important to the ecosystem. So one of the reasons fiddler crabs are so important to this ecosystem is because of the homes that they build, their burrows. So you can see here we have a fiddler crab burrow, and you can see all of these little mud balls. These are actually from them digging down and burrowing into the mud. We've got some different sizes out around here as well because the fiddler crabs will actually eat the mud. They'll take all the nutrients out of there and eat the mud. But the reason why this burrow is so important is because each burrow in the marsh actually allows oxygen to get down into the soil, helping to aerate the soil and keeping it healthy.
As you wander through the marsh, you may see hundreds to thousands of fiddler crabs scurrying on the mud. These fiddler crabs are an important food source for many animals in the marsh, including diamondback terrapins, raccoons, or marsh birds such as herons or egrets. These marsh birds and other birds will spend time in the last section of the marsh that we're visiting today, the hammock.
Alright, so we've talked about a few of the plants and animals that live in the lower marshes. But here we are in an area that's going to stay a little more elevated, an area that's going to be outside of the water, even at high tide. This is called our hammock. Looks a little bit like our maritime forest. This is the area that a lot of animals will use if they're passing through our area. This might be a rest over spot, including the animal that left this feather. It's not a flamingo, but one of our roseate spoonbills, a really neat bird that'll spend some time out in our marsh. These hammocks are really important stopover zones for a lot of migrating species, so it's important that we protect our marsh and keep it safe. So we've talked about how the marsh is a really important habitat for a lot of animals, but the marsh has a lot of other services as well, including acting as a filter. As brackish water moves into the marsh and sits in the marsh, it slowly starts to seep into the ground and adds to our groundwater, where we get a lot of our drinking water from. Another service the marsh provides is acting as a sponge. Whenever we have a large storm coming in, such as a hurricane, a lot of the water that the hurricane brings with it will actually sit and be able to collect inside the marsh rather than moving into our cities and flooding our cities. These marshes are incredibly important habitats, and we are super lucky to be able to come visit them here on Jekyll. Thanks so much for coming and seeing it with us. See you next week.